need me to add her credentials on here and write it down really quick?
That's okay. Do you want me to tell people to sit down, or do you want me to give people grace
just
to wait?
to
Or
grab their, we'll get started here in 2 minutes, so to grab their food.
is this on, or? All right. If you would go ahead and grab your food, we're going to start in 2 minutes. So here's your 2-minute warning. If you are a Dallas Cowboys player, this means stack up your plan for the penalties that'll cost you the game. Everyone else, grab your food, and we'll start in 2 minutes. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our lunch. I hope you all have enjoyed the first two panels. Really want to thank Corrine Martinez and Selena Rodriguez for doing an amazing job. All of our panelists for participating in it. If you haven't grabbed a box lunch, feel free to do so. But we're going to get this lunch program underway. We want to have a conversation at this lunch about litigation and the judiciary and the role that the foundation and the state of Texas has played in advancing, frankly, securing our border, which is to the primary benefit of Texas and the United States, but also benefits Mexico as well. And there's no better individual to discuss that than my friend and colleague, our general counsel and executive director, Rob Henneke. So thank you for joining us. I want to give you a little bit of background on him. Before joining the foundation, Rob served as the twice-elected Kirk County attorney, where he brought conservative values to county government. Rob began his legal career serving as an assistant attorney general in the general litigation division under the leadership of a Texas AG who you may have heard of, Greg Abbott. And he earned his law degree from the University of Texas School of Law and an undergrad in English literature from Georgetown University. So join me in welcoming Rob Henneke to discuss this. My distinguished colleague, Melissa Ford, some of you saw Melissa and I last night talking on the Hard Country recording. Melissa is leading this conversation. Melissa has an amazing background, White House veteran, Bolivian American, actually. I think that's, brings a lot of good perspective for us, and currently serves as a policy director in our Secure and Sovereign Frontier campaign, where she advances an agenda for liberty in making sure that Texas has the sovereignty and security it requires. So without further ado, I will turn this conversation over to Melissa and Rob. You're gonna do a conversation, then Q&A, is that right?
Yes, we've reserved 20 minutes at the end for Q&A, so
superb.
have your questions ready.
All right, take it away, guys.
All right, well, thank you, Josh, for the kind introduction, and hi, everyone. Welcome to our first inaugural U.S.-Mexico Policy Summit. We're happy to have you here. I hope you found this morning's panel conversations as informative as I did. So for this lunch portion, I'm really honored to be joined by Rob Henneke. Rob, before you were in the role that you're in now, you were the director for the Center for the American Future, which is our litigation division here at the Foundation. So I think you know better than pretty much anyone what it's like to fight back against that threat of federal overreach and defend the liberties and the freedom of people here in Texas and the United States. So I wanted to shift from this morning's discussions. As all of you saw, we talked about the U.S.'s relationship with Mexico, Texas's relationship with Mexico, and now we're going to talk about that link, so Texas's relationship with the U.S. And so we've all heard about how Texas has had to step up and defend itself from a federal government that honestly is not doing their job when it comes to securing the border. So I wanted to start by kind of setting the tone and asking you, how is it that Texas can defend itself? What authority does it have?
Well, thank you for that, and good afternoon, everyone. I mean, it's a good way of setting the context. Melissa mentioned where I joined the foundation 8 years ago to create a litigation center within TPPF called the Center for the American Future. And it was the vision and the leadership of our board of directors that created that, recognizing, and this is back in 2015, how so much during the quaint days of the Obama administration, how much of what we consider policy was not being made in the legislative branch. It was being made in the executive branch and the legislative or the judiciary, and by not having a litigation component, the foundation was being left out of so many important liberty fights. Visionary for TPPF to join that space back in 2015, before really conservative litigation was a thing, but jump forward here, certainly in the context of the U.S. Constitution, the border crisis, and so forth, we absolutely see where Congress has frozen and refused to act, really has ceased to operate as a co-equal branch of government, that policymaking in our nation is being set through constitutional litigation against the federal government, and where important wins are being achieved, not just by our state attorneys general, but also by groups like the Foundation that are going to enforce the rights and texts and limitations set not just in federal law, but the U.S. Constitution. And so, I see this right now in the three most influential individuals right now in terms of setting United States national border security and immigration policy. And I'm not saying for the better, all of these, but certainly what the debacle, the travesty that Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas is doing is certainly setting policy. I think as you all have heard through this morning, the role that the President of Mexico is doing in contributing to the border crisis as well. But I think there's an important third person to note, with credit to Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, as really maybe within the top three most influential people right now that are influencing the border crisis policy going on right now. And keeping in mind that the very first legal win against the Biden administration on the second day of his administration was a Texas lawsuit where they got an injunction order against the Biden administration for their breach of an agreement that Texas had negotiated with the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration. So going very back to the very beginning and continuing since then, Texas has led our state attorney general's office with this great team, has been very effective in court wins and cases to try to enforce federal law and to, get legal wins against the malfeasance that this administration is doing. A long-winded wind-up to now answer your question, Melissa. But, authorities there, Texas has all of the powers granted to, the states, actually reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment, that are explicitly granted to the federal government. And certainly in a broad context, Texas has, as a state, has police powers. In fact, the federal government does not have police powers. But as a state, Texas has the police powers to protect for the public health, safety, and welfare of its state and of its constituencies. And that's where we think of in the context of like law enforcement, public safety, environmental regulations, all sorts of regulatory areas that states are really the proper policymaker in terms of engaging on those actors. And then you also have had here recently the discussion about the powers granted to states to engage in war without the consent of Congress in times of imminent danger or actual invasion. That's Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution. So really in two big overlapping ways, we're talking about Texas's authority to react and respond and properly take action to the border crisis that is not just at our front gates, but inside the fence line with what we've been dealing with for the past couple of years.
Thank you, Rob. I just want to agree, first of all, that our Attorney General and our Governor have been leaders on this. And they can be, but they shouldn't have to be, right? The federal government is the entity with the most amount of resources, and it is their constitutionally assigned responsibility to do that. But it's certainly reassuring to know that we're not left defenseless when that doesn't happen. And so I just wanted to ask you, as you know, we've been in a special session, and the governor just called for a special session yesterday. But last week, when we were still in special session, I testified in support of a bill that would reaffirm the state of Texas's authority to secure its border and to protect its people. But I was just talking about yesterday with Josh on the podcast, I was the only person there testifying in support, and there were 19 people there testifying against it. And what we constantly heard was people saying that Texas doesn't have that authority, and that is the federal government's authority to secure the border. And that's something that we hear all the time. So I just want to ask you, why is that something that we're constantly told, that Texas doesn't have that authority? And what can we do to combat that misinformation? I mean, are people just brainwashed? What can we do so that people understand that we do have the authority?
I mean, I think starting with what is unfortunately a shift over the past 100 years where, we don't recognize the state's role as policymakers for the nation, in seeking to have 51 imperfect solutions that then improve our societies. Each state seeks to implement policies that best benefit its constituency. I think overall we are way, way too accepting of a national federal solution as where the answers to the problems that we face are. So, I think in terms of our just kind of civics awareness, generally speaking in our communities, there's just a lot of lack of acceptance of states having an important co-equal role, sometimes a more important role in this because, Washington, D.C. needs to fix all of our problems. Obviously, I don't agree with that, but that, I think, is a general concern that's there. I think, the other is the unprecedented aspect of this. I mean, I remember the border crisis when, under the Obama administration, where you had these migrant caravans, these caravans of illegal immigrants that are coming up, and thousands were coming at the time and coming and attacking the border. But at least there was a semblance of an effort by the Obama administration to try to deal with that. And then I think the Trump administration was largely successful in implementing policies that did secure the border during that. And of course, that has all been repealed by the Biden administration. That is now not just apathy, but actual attacking upon the efforts to provide for border security, our national safety, the safety of our citizens. And so, what do you do? What do you do when your federal government isn't just doing a bad job, but they are purposefully working to make it worse? And, it's situations, we'll talk about some of the recent lawsuits, but the policies that I'm sure you all have talked about, for example, pulling your Border Patrol agents off of the border because the Biden administration is focused upon not having any kind of public political crises that would be politically embarrassing to the administration, such as when you had 15,000 Haitian immigrants amassed under that bridge down South Texas last year. That looks really bad on camera. And so what this administration has done is saying, we just want to make sure we just get them through as fast as possible and disperse them to the rest of the United States so that there aren't going to be these embarrassing pictures for Bill Maloogian to be able to put on Fox showing the massing of kids in cages and migrant camps and all of that. So we're going to redeploy all of our Border Patrol agents to now being not law enforcement and working in their border security capacity. We're going to make them just processing people faster. And that's one of the misnomers from this administration when they keep talking about wanting more money for border security and why won't Republicans give us more money for border security? They just want more resources to be able to facilitate the crisis faster, as through this fiction that somehow creating a policy of illegal entry then somehow makes it legal, which it does not. But really, for credit to the great work that Governor Abbott and the state of Texas is doing, if we didn't have Operation Lone Star happening right now, I think in most parts of South Texas, we would have no presence whatsoever along the southern border. So, the point that I'm making, and then in some of the recent litigation, is the sea change to where it's not just the incompetence of this administration, it's the intentional malfeasance that's creating this situation where Texas has to respond because there really is no one else to address the crisis.
Thank you, Rob. And I want us to jump into the lawsuits right after this question, but you kind of led into this idea that what do we do after the federal government decides that it's not going to maintain their obligations towards us, and moreover, that they're going to align with a foreign antagonist against their own people and their own citizens? And so I want to ask you, what recourse is there? Because we often, I know a lot of people on our campaign can say this, but we're often asked why Texas can't just do things, right? People say, why can't we just build a wall? Why can't we just declare an invasion? And so I want to hear from you, and you're probably the best person here suited to answer this question, but why is this judicial fight just as important as a legislative one?
I think it's, and I get a little frustrated with that because tremendous amount of credit needs to be given to Governor Abbott, to Board Czar Mike Banks here, to the legislature for appropriating the funds for the incredible men and women of our Department of Public Safety and our State National Guard that are down there. So when it's like, I know some of the frustration that I think is coming from the policymakers is that where we basically deployed half of our state law enforcement to the border for the past 2 years, meaning that every other community in Texas is less served by law enforcement. We've spent billions of dollars a year, taxpayer dollars, on this effort. Sometimes I think it's fair when the feedback from policymakers when they're told, why won't Texas do something? It's the response to say, like, what more do you want us to do there? And so the crisis, though, is creating like real challenges that have never been addressed before. And it takes time to figure that out. It takes time to deploy billions of dollars in resources. I'll give you one example, Melissa, and part of what our SSF team has done over the past years is we've led delegations down to the border to actually see the operations there. I remember going down during the Trump administration to see the actual construction of the wall, to meet with Border Patrol officials to meet with immigrations and customs enforcement officials to get kind of an understanding, meeting with local landowners and sheriffs and everything. And we've taken policymakers and media and conservative leaders and elected officials down there to help educate them on this. And I think it's been very effective. But one of the things that when we met with Border Patrol and would say, like, what do you need? What works? And this is during the Trump administration specifically. They said there's 4 things. We need 4 things. We need all 4 things. This doesn't work without 4 things. We need infrastructure, we need personnel, we need technology, and we need policy. And that was the combination there that works together. And what they were talking about, infrastructure obviously was the wall. But the purpose of the wall historically has not been a Great Wall of China. And I think sometimes that's the misnomer, is that when we think of the wall, we think of the Great Wall of China along the southern border. That's never been what was intended. What was intended was to have infrastructure to create an obstacle that would then funnel illegal migration towards points where technology could detect persons entering illegally, so then you could deploy personnel to be able to apprehend them. But then that only works when you have policies in place that serve as a deterrent for people to enter illegally. The combination of infrastructure, technology, and personnel works when you then have a volume of individuals that you're able to deal with. But then when you have the policies of this administration that are allowing people to remain and have work permits and stay in America for indefinite periods of time without being expelled, that's created the incentive that's resulted in, some estimates say, 10 million people coming in illegally into this country during the current administration. And when you have that volume, then the combination of infrastructure, technology, and personnel gets overwhelmed, and that's largely what I'm saying. But I put that in the context, Melissa, because the past concept of infrastructure was to be in the partnership with technology, personnel, and policy to be able to then do this. And that's why the wall has always been built in certain segments and kind of set back from the southern border from the Rio Grande, because then you would then have the enforcement of the policy that once you had apprehended the persons entering illegally through the combination of the 3 other legs on the stool, you'd kick them out, you deport them. We've never had the need to actually have a physical barrier to stop someone from entering this country in the first place. And so that's been then the change of the approach now that you have the absolute refusal by the Biden administration in the reversal of all of the Trump policies that were actually effective in securing the border, and where you have the removal of personnel that are intended to apprehend persons that are here, and for a long period of time you had the refusal to construct infrastructure and so forth. Then it was Texas has had to respond by saying we're gonna keep these people out in the first place. And so that's then where you've had the deployment of physical barriers at the Rio Grande, at the banks of the southern border, then designed to keep persons out from coming into this country in the first place. And so that's what the recent fight has been over, is that several months ago, Texas started putting floating buoys in the river in key shallow parts that were intended as actually designed by Border Patrol, but to be effective in preventing away from people, coming into the United States in the first place in these parts of the river that are, about this deep. But the buoys are huge. You can't climb over them, and there's netting below. You can't swim underneath them. So it physically blocks someone from coming in here, keeping in mind that, the United States technically starts at the midpoint of the river. You're in the United States before you hit dry land. And then also the deployment of razor wire and concertina wire on the banks to physically stop people from coming into Texas illegally in the first place, because we know that once they're in Texas, the Biden administration is not removing them and not following the law. So those situations have created the clash, and I'll let you ask a follow-up question, Melissa, but that's where you had the Biden administration sue Texas several months ago over the placement of the buoys, and TPPF actually joined that lawsuit representing 32 members of Congress in filing an amicus brief on behalf of the state of Texas. And then here 2 weeks ago, after repeated instances of Border Patrol actually cutting the Texas razor wire and pulling it aside with trucks to allow groups of aliens to enter the country illegally, Texas, with the Texas Public Policy Foundation as co-counsel, sued the Biden administration to stop them from their active destruction of the physical barriers that Texas has erected to keep people out.
Thank you, Rob. Oh, sorry, now it's on. Thank you, Rob. So yeah, that's something that Josh and I were talking about yesterday on the podcast, but we know that our governor is also a litigator, and he's a good one, and that he has realized that, you know, it's smart for Texas to take this path and to fight back, because what happens in governance now happens in the judicial branch. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to fill in a couple of blanks for our audience about some of the recent and very alarming statistics that we're seeing at our border. So the numbers from fiscal year 2023 broke all kinds of records, and not the good ones. But this fiscal year, was considered the worst year ever at America's border. Last month, encounters between ports of entry at the southern border surpassed 218,000, and total encounters in the fiscal year surpassed 2 million, and that's between ports of entry. And as we know, that's a tiny fraction of the actual people that are coming in. So among them were 169 individuals on the FBI's terror watch list, 18 of them last month, the most on record, and that's more than the last 6 fiscal years combined. So if you're not scared enough, let me tell you that this doesn't include the 1.7 million known gotaways that we've had since President Biden took office. And since the new fiscal year started on October 1st, we've been seeing approximately 1,000 coming in every day. And that's known gotaways. So that doesn't include the number of people that are coming in undetected. So I wanted to give a little bit of background before we talk about why Texas has stepped up and why these court cases are happening, right? So you touched on the buoy barrier case, and I do want you to talk a little bit more about TPPF's involvement in that buoy barrier case. But the reason that the federal government is suing Texas, they cited a couple of different reasons. One, they said it violates federal law, which is what we're talking about now. Second, they said it poses a threat to navigation. And third, they're really worried about whether it's going to damage our diplomatic relation with Mexico. So if you could talk a little bit more about like TPPF's involvement, why it's so important for us to jump on that, and then I want to ask you about the razor cutting case.
Sure. So on the buoy case, and I think this goes back to the original comment that I made about how I think often we are just too accepting by default of the authority and role of the federal government. And so TPPF was glad to have a really a signature role in the buoy lawsuit, because after Texas had deployed the buoys in the river, the federal government sued under the statute called the River and Harbors Act statute, claiming that this violated the statute. And everybody just started jumping forward to then arguing over whether it was a violation of the statute. And we started at TPPF and said, in working with partnership with Congressman Arrington and Chip Roy and, like I said, 32 other members of Congress, of saying, how do they have authority in the first place? How does the federal government have the power to tell Texas not to put buoys in the Texas side of the Rio Grande? You know, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives the limited enumerated powers that are granted to the federal government. If it's not given to the federal government, they can't do it. So I know there's a statute, but where does the statute apply, and what gives the federal government the power to enforce this Rivers and Harbors Act in the Rio Grande against the state of Texas, putting these buoys in the river? Well, the premise was that the federal government has authority over navigable waterways as instruments of commerce pursuant to the Commerce Clause. So the premise then why the Rivers and Harbors Act applied is through this Commerce Clause power applicable to the instrumentalities of commerce. Okay. Well, is the Rio Grande navigable? The answer is no. But we were the ones to point that out. And, we looked in and said, well, it has to be navigable if the federal government's going to have authority over the Rio Grande to enforce this. What's the basis for them to say it's navigable? And it was kind of overlooked. And so we dug into it, and it turns out there was like a 1970 Army Corps of Engineers, report that pointed to some study from the 1940s that said listed the Rio Grande as under a list of navigable rivers. And we're like, well, that's not very current. There has to be current jurisdiction for the federal government to have authority. And in fact, y'all see this, especially during the summer of drought. There's a lot of parts in the Rio Grande, it's dry, or it's ankle deep, and you can walk across it. You're certainly not taking a commercial vessel up and down that part. And specifically in the areas where the buoys had been deployed, like I said, literally it's about knee deep in some of these areas, which is why the buoys were necessary, because the river was so shallow that you could just have, 1,000 people walk across during a day. So our amicus brief pointed out the fact that the Rio Grande, in that stretch, that the federal government had not shown evidence demonstrating its jurisdiction, because it had not proven in its lawsuit, in its injunction motion, that the Rio Grande in these sections was a navigable waterway that would then trigger federal authority. And it's like, heads exploded about what do you mean? We just say it is, so it must be the case. And so that really became the central issue that was litigated in the injunction hearing that happened at the trial court. The judge was not really willing to consider Texas's counter arguments in terms of its authority being pursuant to its police powers or pursuant to its state war powers under Article 1, Section 10. The judge was just dialed into the Rivers and Harbors Act, and ultimately was satisfied. I think, not that the government proved its case, but I think the judge tried to prove their case for them, that he wrote as part of his opinion, really unpacking how he found that the Rio Grande was navigable, sufficient for the act to apply. Now, I think that that's going to be a really important question on appeal at the Fifth Circuit as we wait for the panel to issue its ruling and so forth. But that very case could turn upon the argument that TPPF made on behalf of our clients, the members of Congress, in pointing out that the underlying premise for which the federal government sought to have enforcement just was not applicable.
And then on kind of the other side of the coin, now we have Texas suing the federal government because earlier this summer, I think it was in September, there was a video that came out of 5 Border Patrol agents that were cutting through razor wire, and you can see on the video that they are holding it open and helping migrants get through, helping them up through an embankment, and then you can see them lining up to be processed. And so we have this other side of the coin where Texas is now suing the federal government for, very reasonably, I think, for cutting something that we as a state have put in place to protect our border. And so I want you to talk a little bit more about that and TPPF's involvement. I'm sure a lot of people in this room that are from Texas can understand the desire to want to come to this state, but what is, I think, unthinkable is the fact that we have a government that is not just allowing it, but actually facilitating it.
So this is really breaking news right now. And first of all, just again want to credit the great team that Ken Paxton has in working with us and being lead counsel on this case. There was a hearing yesterday in Del Rio seeking to make permanent the injunction that we've initially won against the Biden administration, ordering them to stop destroying the barriers there. Mike, you testified as part of that, and we don't have a ruling from the court, but it seems like the judge, the federal judge in Del Rio, who was not a conservative firebrand, but was very upset at what was going on and seemed very positive to our case. Jumping back a couple of weeks, the Texas Attorney General's office with us, TPPF, as co-counsel, filed this lawsuit over the repeated examples of where Border Patrol had been coming in and using bolt cutters and wire cutters to cut the razor wire and then pulling that aside to allow people to enter this country illegally. We filed a lawsuit, and then you actually had the doubling down of the Biden administration, where 2 days after we filed this lawsuit, then they started using forklift tractors to come in and physically lift up the razor wire, lifted up in the air. And in one instance, our Texas law enforcement documented you had over 300 people come in underneath the opening that was made because the tractor was lifting up the razor wire. And so we crashed on an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order. We filed the lawsuit on Tuesday. Thursday, they start using the forklifts. We file our emergency temporary restraining order motion on Friday. And the judge, to her credit, worked over the weekend, and Monday morning last week kicked out a temporary restraining order, an emergency TRO, ordering the Biden administration to stop any further destruction of the Texas razor wire and property there unless it was for some urgent, life-threatening medical emergency. It was an exception the judge created. But our hearing yesterday was on the question of the judge making that injunction permanent while the lawsuit remains in place. And so the judge promised to have a ruling by at least by Monday. But I think what's novel about this, in this case here, two kind of important principles that we're litigating in this suit that Texas has brought. I mean, first of all, we've sued under the Administrative Procedures Act, which makes it unlawful for executive agencies to act arbitrarily and capriciously in violation of their obligations under law. And we've got a whole litany list of all of the various federal immigration statutes that say Border Patrol's jobs is to enforce the immigration laws and to keep people out of this country illegally. And here's this statute, this statute, this statute. And so by cutting the razor wire to facilitate people entering illegally, you're not doing your job under the law. But I think the other interesting case is part of this lawsuit is that, look, this Texas razor wire, it's Texas property. It's paid for by the taxpayers of the state of Texas. It belongs to Texas. Texas has permission from the landowners to lay it across the bank of the Rio Grande. And the feds are damaging our property. And so the other aspect of the lawsuit is that we have sued actually under state tort claims to stop the damage to our property, just like if somebody was coming in and, into your yard and like kicking over your fence or breaking the things on your property. It's Texas property. And so it seeks to reinvigorate actually an amount of case law that allows for the federal government to be liable for damage to property for violations of state law when federal officials are acting outside of their authority in an ultra-virus type capacity. So kind of a novel idea. I mean, this used to be back in the 1700s and 1800s how it would work. When the federal agent, ran over your chicken in the front yard of your farm, you could sue and get, recovery for that. And, these cases have kind of been long forgotten. But I think what's interesting to watch in our case is the revitalization of these theories that let states and individual citizens seek recovery from the federal government when the federal government causes them direct harm. So we're at the initial stages, but so far the temporary restraining order was a big success for Texas and the partnership that TPPF is proud to be a part of. And we should have more news here, if not Friday, then Monday, on next steps in the case.
Thank you, Rob. I know we're all excited to see where it goes, and we're all proud of you guys for doing that work. Josh and I always say this, but Texas is right to push back because we have nowhere else to go. And it's very dangerous and it's very foolish to think that the only pathway for American people on American soil is to shut up and submit and just basically not be able to do anything when the federal government is pursuing those actions. And so I wanted to share a quick anecdote before I ask you your last question, and that is some of our colleagues at SSF did a border trip a couple of months ago. I think it was 2 or 3 months ago. And they met with some ranchers in Stark County, Texas, and one of them was a U.S. Army veteran. And he fought for our country and he defended our country, and now he's living on the border, this like remote area. And he asked our colleagues, he said, like, well, where are they now? Like, why aren't they defending me? And I thought that was very impactful, and I wanted to share it with you. And I always think we have more time than we do, and I want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A. But I wanted to ask you about one more thing, and that is, I told you I'd ask you this. It's not controversial at all, but Arizona v. U.S. And a lot of people have heard about it, but for context, this is, in 2010, the state of Arizona passed a law that caused the Obama administration to sue Arizona. And that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 2012, the court found that Arizona's state immigration provisions conflicted with federal immigration laws. So I wanted to ask you to talk briefly about it. And the reason that I bring it up, I know it's an old case, but I think it's very relevant because even some of the arguments by litigators in the Bowie Barrier case use this same rhetoric. But my question is, how does this Arizona v. U.S. case and that precedent play into the state of immigration law at the state level now?
I don't know that we have immigration law at the state level, and I think it's important to distinguish the state roles versus the federal roles and where the Supreme Court came down in Arizona v. U.S. in terms of the majority opinion holding that it was within federal law to enforce the immigration law, have a unified naturalization law, and to enforce the federal laws, and how that then preempted Arizona's efforts to have a separate state law regulatory scheme on that. I think in a short way to answer that question, because there's been the discussion about how Arizona v. U.S. was wrong, I think it was, how the Scalia dissent was really the correct outcome in talking at how states have the constitutional power to enforce their border autonomy, which includes being able to take actions to remove persons who are illegally within that state. I think they do, but I don't think it's repealing or reversing Arizona v. U.S. is necessarily the on the horizon or the reasonable panacea or the panacea that it's being talked about there, because I don't think the votes are there. Everybody's like, well, that was 2010, and now we've got this great Trump court that got rid of Roe and did all these kind of things. So of course we get this case up to there, they're going to throw it out and reverse and so forth. I wish I had the optimism. You still have to count to 5 on the Supreme Court. And the thing about Arizona v. U.S., it wasn't a 5-4 decision. It was a 5-3 decision where Kennedy wrote for the majority and Roberts joined that majority. And it was actually Kagan who recused herself because she had been the Solicitor General under Obama. So you had, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia in the 3-vote minority. But if you look at the court here today, Roberts already held with a majority in 2010. And so then you would have to assume that you could hold Barrett and Kavanaugh in order to overturn Arizona v. U.S. And I think that that's, not as lock certain as some would suggest. But I don't think you have to get there. I mean, the point of this is not to have a Texas immigration system. I mean, I do concede that And if you look at the origin of the Constitution, the reason you did have immigration granted to the federal government is because, as discussed in the Federalist Papers, you actually wanted to have a uniform system because we weren't a state then, but basically because we didn't want Oklahoma admitting a bunch of people that we didn't like that could then come into Texas. And so the idea was to have a national standard that would actually be enforced by the federal government on that. But I separate immigration law from what's happening at the border. Border security, what's happening here is certainly a dereliction of duty, but it is an attack upon this country, and it is a law enforcement, it is a public safety type issue. And I think that's where we need to put our focus. That's where I think that the barbed wire and the buoy cases and the Operation Lone Star, the efforts by Governor Abbott in terms of the enhanced truck inspections across our ports of entry, where we are dealing with this as a law enforcement, public safety issue, I think is squarely within the powers of state of Texas. And as we can more frame that and address that, I think Texas is on really, really strong ground. And also at the same time as, we explore really what additional powers are granted to the state under the War Powers Clause of Article 1, Section 10, which is still kind of to be determined. But, I think in looking at, the reality of Arizona v. U.S. and the count on the Supreme Court, that, adopting a, state-level immigration code would have a hard time in the federal courts. But as long as we continue to do and continue to ratchet up what we are doing in terms of addressing this as a law enforcement, quasi-military, public safety, public security campaign and effort to keep every single person out of this country that does not belong here under the law, then that is where we're on solid footing, and we'll continue to do things like the buoys and the razor wire and other efforts to defend the sovereignty of Texas. So my advice and takeaway on that is I just really think where Texas has the strongest ground has been in the areas that we're moving, and we just need to continue to ratchet that up, to address the crisis that's at hand.
Thank you, Rob. I think all Texans have learned, unfortunately, the bitter lesson that we can expect very little from our federal government, but it's very reassuring to know that we can expect more from our state. So thank you, Rob. I want to leave enough time for Q&A. If anyone has questions, there's going to be somebody walking around with a microphone. Erica over there.
Yes, sir.
But we are filming this, so wait till the microphone gets to you before you ask your question. Please go ahead.
Thanks for the very interesting summation of litigation. But there's one case that I think Texas has been a leader on. I don't know if PPF is also involved, and that is the abuse of the administration in the humanitarian public interest parole dimension, simply to bring people in as a resource demand for, I think, 24 states led by Texas have been behind this litigation, saying that the administration can't just start bringing people in based on this very flimsy parole excuse. Can you update us on that case?
Yeah, that's a great question there. I mean, there's many other border security related immigration lawsuits that are out, that are pending, that I've not had the time to do. You mentioned, how the administration is arguing that what they're doing is legal. I mean, Mayorkas, every time he goes to Congress, is saying, yes, we have a secure border, which is garbage. We don't. We see that, but in their mind, if there is a semblance of a regulatory scheme or a law that allows for them to act unlawfully, then all of that is, I guess, secure under their alternate definition of the term. But to your point, there is, you have the parole definition. You have, temporary protected status that was, intended to give, a category of persons during like a hurricane, the way to enter this country. These were things that were written to be really isolated, discretionary, limited exceptions to federal power to enforce our immigration laws. And this administration is using those little examples of discretion to just be blanket across the board rules. And the problem is that the courts, the Supreme Court, the Texas case, I think related to this, I'm not sure if it was that case, got all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the court said that it was, discretionary, that Congress had granted discretion in that. So we have problems with our laws and the immigration laws in the books that have, discretionary type actions that are being abused here. We've got to fix those, but I'm not going to say that elections are the solution, or that we just have to elect different people in Congress, because the crisis that we're facing is the crisis now. Instead, I think that that's an example of where this administration is willing to look for any loophole that it can in federal code to give it justification. We got to keep doing more of what we're doing to keep persons out of this state in the first place, and provide a deterrent to not want individuals to be able to come to Texas illegally in violation of our laws. Thank you for the question.
All right, we had time for one question. Thank you, and we're out of time. So thanks everyone for being here. Thank you so much, Rob, for your time, and we'll all meet for panel number 3 back downstairs in the lobby. Thank you.
Hey, hand for Melissa and Rob, please. And we'll see you downstairs at 1:10.